The highway nomads. I don't have any way of being 100% sure that what I saw were Sasquatch, but I'm unable to develop any other semi-logical theories. In any case, it felt like an otherworldly experience. It was less than 2 years ago that my wife and I were on a road trip from San Francisco to Portland. When the sighting happened, we were on a stretch of the I-5 highway between Mount Shasta, California, and Ashland, Oregon. One of the strangest aspects of what we saw was that it occurred in a much more barren landscape than I would have ever expected to see something like it in. We hit the road very early that morning, and I remember the sunrise had just begun. The colors in the sky were spectacular. About a half-mile ahead, we saw some cars pulled over along the side of the road. We figured that they had merely stopped at a place that enabled them to get some snapshots of the scenery that very much resembled a pastel painting. But it was soon after we got out of the car that we learned something else had caught their attention. "Those are very rare apes," I heard a man say to his kids as I walked by, trying to locate an optimal view. At first I assumed that I had misunderstood the guy, but soon after that I aimed my phone toward the sunrise and noticed the band of moving shapes. There were 6 of them altogether. Even though they were maybe 200 yards off, there was no question that these things were something other than human. I often think how calm and casual that man was when he explained to his children that they were looking at rare apes. It sounded no different at all from when a parent is educating their child on whatever animal you'd typically find in a zoo. Maybe I'm making a big deal of it, but that just came off so damn weird to me. Trust me when I tell you there was absolutely nothing at all typical about what we were all staring at. I guess the guy was just trying to prevent his kids from getting scared. So my wife and I, along with what was probably about 7 or 8 other people, stood there gazing at this caravan of odd-looking humanoid shapes. When I laid eyes on the group, the first thing I thought of was the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Every one of these beings' backs was hunched, and their long arms dangled below, occasionally appearing to push off the earth. Even though they were far away, you could tell that they had very thick and durable frames. 5 out of the 6 figures were nearly equal in size, and the other was maybe a little over half of that, leading me to suspect it was 1 or 2 of the creature's offspring. The part that baffles me the most about this sighting is that these travelers were nowhere near dense forest. Even though the landscape was hilly, there was nowhere for them to hide, which is why I'm so confused about how they ended up at that location in the first place. There are many square miles of open land in that area, yet they decided to venture relatively close to a frequented highway. That just makes no sense to me. I don't even recall seeing a single tree in that area, aside from whatever covered the surface of the mountain range way off in the distance. Those mountains had to be miles away. At the time we pulled over and parked, nothing was obstructing our view of them. Therefore, nothing was preventing them from seeing us. As far as we could tell, they seemed utterly unfazed by the presence of their spectators. Since they were far off, it didn't appear that the group was moving very fast, but I'm confident it was much quicker than what you would see from any group of human hikers. The size of their limbs alone would make it much easier to cover more ground with less effort. What's unfortunate is that these creatures were still too far away for the lens of any smartphone to capture their unique traits. However, I did see at least a couple of other people with professional-grade cameras. My wife and I hoped that we would easily be able to locate that footage on the internet, but either we haven't been searching the web with the correct keywords, or they never uploaded anything. My wife said she heard about our authority removing stuff like that from the internet, but I'm not sure whether I can take that whole conspiracy route too seriously. I know there are things that our government doesn't want us to know, but I just have trouble seeing what motives they would have for suppressing this kind of thing. Even though the creatures were too far away to view their eyes or any facial features, we could still make out that they were covered with dark hair from head to toe. It's no wonder that they traveled during the early morning hours, because that area would have been scorching in the afternoon. Someone once asked me if I'm certain that they weren't dogmen, and I told them that I didn't see any sign of protruding ears or snout. I always thought that was a funny question, because it felt like the guy implied that a dogman sighting would be more believable. The rising sun's effect made the whole scene appear very cinematic, and it soon became clear that the band of travelers was veering toward the other side of the hill they were currently trekking across. Suddenly, a small child that was with a couple of people parked beside us began crying hysterically. I doubt she could have been any older than 2 years, and I don't even know whether her distress was associated with the creatures. Regardless, my wife and I heard some other woman yell, "Look! It's looking at us!" I turned my head back toward the hill and got the first glimpse of how tall these things were. Even though the other creatures didn't appear very fussed, the single fully erect one looked concerned. Its posture reminded me of when prairie dogs are on high alert due to a nearing threat. I can't be sure whether the child's crying triggered its behavior, but before we knew it, the erect creature was charging toward the highway. Even though it was still so far away, the amount of ground that it quickly covered motivated people to begin heading toward their cars. "Come on, sweetie, it's okay," the crying child's father said as he scooped her up in his arms. The creature was now running toward us so fast that we could make out little clouds of dust getting kicked up behind it. There's no question that I was frightened, but I also felt tempted to stick around a little longer because it seemed like each passing moment enabled a more detailed view of the approaching being. I only got a brief view of the thing's facial features, and I remember thinking they were so much broader than those of any human. I've heard some people say that they look like cavemen, but I didn't see it that way. That face was entirely different from anything else I had ever imagined a Sasquatch to look like. I'll go as far as to say that the closest thing it resembled in my mind was the face of a sloth. But, unfortunately, I got such a quick look at those features because once it was within a football field's length away, my wife pretty much dragged me back into our car. That was when I noticed that we had been the last ones to seek shelter. My wife entered the driver's seat and sped off immediately. There was something about that approaching creature that made her panic. I guess I was just so amazed by the sighting, and they somehow overpowered any feelings of fear. I so badly wish someone would get a hold of the body of one of these things and perform an autopsy so we can learn precisely what they are. Like I said before, I assumed that I would be able to find the footage, or at least photos of the event on the internet, but neither of us had any luck. I imagine that some of the other people who pulled over acquired a passion for studying Sasquatch afterwards. Maybe some of them are even reading these books. If you were one of those folks who pulled over on the I-5 to see those creatures in the summer of 2019, please contact Stephen Armstrong. My wife and I would love nothing more than to speak to someone else who experienced that whole thing.